We will look at development of air transportation in India. The aim of this talk is to get an appreciation of how the field of air transportation was initiated in the country and how it has developed in the recent years. Towards the end, we will also look at some policy initiatives which have been taken by the previous and the current central government to encourage, promote and also to regulate the air transportation sector in the country. So, this talk is going to be a little bit of historical nature because we will trace the developments of this field in the country. Let us start from the pre-independence era. In 1903, the Wright brothers were the first people to achieve successful flight of a heavier than aircraft with a human being on board in a controlled manner with a powered aircraft. But till 1910, there was hardly any activity regarding civil aviation in our country, even though we were under the British rule. In 1920, the Indian Air Board was formed. The creation of Indian Air Board was through a memorandum which was focusing on the prevention of foreign dominance in India's air transport in 1926. This was going on because government lacked the resources to run its own airline, and therefore foreign airlines began dominating the air transport sector in the country. In 1929, Indian Air State Service was formed. This was an arrangement that involved chartered flights, but with the direct involvement of the government. The technical and operational control was retained by Imperial Airways over the Karachi to Delhi route, which was the first major air transportation route created in the country. Going ahead, let us look at the development of a few indigenous domestic airlines in the pre-independence era. The first scheduled airline was Tata Air Service, which began operations on 15th October 1932, and that is why 15th October every year is celebrated in the country as the birth date of civil aviation in India. The Tata Air Service transported mail from Karachi to Bombay via Ahmedabad and Madras. They had a 10-year agreement with the government and it was a resounding success. Another such initiative was in 1933. There was an Indian National Airways, and this was focusing on the eastern part of the country. It carried passengers, mail and freight from the then Calcutta to Rangoon and Calcutta to Dhaka routes. All of these were under the British rule at that time. Then there was a Delhi Flying Club established in 1928, which got approval for transporting mail for 1.5 years in 1932. So, these were the main indigenous domestic airlines at that time. There were a few more about which we will study. In 1938, for the first time, the government introduced first class mail transport without any surcharge, and under this scheme, two airlines, the Indian National Airways INA and Tata Airlines, they were offered a 15-year contract under this particular scheme. Now, when the World War II started, then in 1939, That led to the reduction in the mail transport, and also there were restrictions imposed on the passenger traffic, because the funds available with the airlines were diverted for the war efforts at that time. Now, when the war ended in 45, the air transportation sector resumed, but prior to 46 there was no licensing required. So, post World War II, the increase in the air transportation led to more regulations, and there was an air transport licensing board which was established to basically regulate the air travel. The aim of, or the jurisdiction of Air Transport Licensing Board was to grant, to amend, to suspend or to revoke licenses based on the need of the market, traffic requirements and the applicant's capacity. Okay. So, based on that they would grant, amend, suspend or revoke licenses. Now, post 1947, night air services were introduced by Government of India in 1948. Through this scheme, airmail was transported between the major cities of Calcutta, Bombay, Madras and Delhi. Then Delhi, Nagpur, Madras and Bombay, Nagpur, Calcutta routes were also established. Notice that Nagpur, being the geometrical center of the country, was a very logical point through which traffic was diverted, and at those times aircraft were not having such a large range that they could travel directly from Delhi to Madras or Bombay to Calcutta and vice versa. This scheme was reformed in 1949 and it led to very good revenues for the carriers. It also boosted the cargo traffic and greatly improved the postal services. The time taken by the postage to reach the destination was drastically reduced because of the introduction of air services. Then there was a government intervention which allowed the carriers to increase the fares and the payload, and the government gave a partial rebate on customs duty for the air turbine fuel, because air turbine fuel was very expensive. It was mainly imported at that time and the duties were very high, the custom duties were very high, and as we all know, fuel constitutes 35 to 40 even more percentage of the operating cost of an airline. So, therefore, this was a huge financial support to the airlines. In April 49, an all-up mail scheme was launched which boosted the airline revenue. Now, post-independence era continues and we look at now the international operations. So, before 47, the foreign airlines were serving India's international routes. We did not have our own national airline operating on foreign routes. So, in 49, an agreement with the Air India was reached to establish Air India International. Private airlines at that time were not very profitable because they relied totally on the government aid and all kinds of schemes for relief. So, because of that, airlines like Deccan Airways Limited and Himalaya Airlines, which were operating at that time as private airlines apart from the Tata, were not really very successful. In 1950, an Air Transport Enquiry Committee was formed to study the state of the industry and to give recommendations regarding how to take care of the growth of air transport in the country. This led to the nationalization of the airlines. So, in 53, an Air Corporation Act was created through which the Indian aviation industry was nationalized, and this continued till there was a partial deregulation in 1994, about which we will see a little bit later. Let us have a look at the state of the airlines around the period of nationalization and beyond that. So, once the airlines were nationalized, you can notice here that the Indian Airlines, which was operating domestically within the country, was generally in profit, but if you look at from 1990 onwards, there was a huge amount of loss, $121 million loss. So, the Indian Airlines was actually a merger of 8 domestic airlines which were present at that time, and it inherited all the chaotic routes and operational efficiencies that were being run by these 8 airlines, and there was some rationalization done after that. There are many factors that contributed to the loss of Indian Airlines: overcapacity, poor fleet condition, lack of investment in fleet renewal, and competition from private operators. These were the main reasons why the Indian Airlines went into loss. Then the services of Indian Airlines deteriorated and became very limited, and this led to the loss of market share and profits. Let us look at the state of Air India, which fortunately had been mostly in the profit except for a 4-year period of 1970 to 74. And remember, in 1970 we had steep increase in prices of fuel, and in 71 there was a war which led to the Bangladesh liberation. Barring that 4-year period, Air India has mostly been in profit. Now, despite international competition, it has been profitable in all these 30 years. The main reason being the India Gulf route, because of frequent migrant worker travel. So, this gave a consistent market to the Air India. But there was poor capacity growth over time. There were many government restrictions. There was lack of managerial autonomy because the chairman and the managing director of Air India was appointed by the government, and generally the person used to be a bureaucrat. Okay. So, why did Indian Airlines and Air India perform poorly? There are many reasons. We do not want to get into the details here. Primarily, we can say that because of the policy regime and because of the stiff regulations. So, this led to partial deregulation in 1994. So, the economic development led to the motivation for capital, for improved capacity, and for overall economic improvement. All of this increased in the demand of air service, and the aims of the partial deregulation were to attract private investment in the airline industry, which was till that time completely funded by the funds from Government of India. The aim also was to enhance air connectivity because the government had limited funds to create new routes, and also to encourage competition, which leads to professional activities and improvement in the industry. So, there were also many international trends. The global trend in late 1970s was to go for deregulation, and we have already seen the deregulation of the airline in 1978 in the US, which became a path-breaking activity, and it had repercussions all over the world. So, once we had deregulation in 1978 in the USA, New Zealand, Australia, Canada and UK, they all adopted some form of deregulation in 1980s. Okay. The features of deregulated market are: there is a carrier entry exit freedom. Prior to deregulation, people private companies had no way of entering the airline business. It was completely regulated and done by the government. Routes were also pre-decided, fares were also fixed, and subsidies were the only way to run the organization. With the deregulation, all these activities were taken care. There was restrictions on the barrier of entry and exit were removed to a large extent. Airlines could select their routes, they could set their own fares based on competition, and subsidies were removed. So, the worldwide success of deregulation of the air transportation sector literally forced India also to go to look for the deregulation, and it happened partially in 1994. Let us look at a comparison of the airline deregulation between USA and India. The US deregulation was total, whereas the Indian deregulation was partial. Private airlines were regulated before deregulation, but in India the government owned carriers, they faced resource constraints. So the market was partially deregulated, but Air India and Indian Airlines still were continuing to operate. The US deregulation was motivated by research for industry efficiency. In India, it was done primarily because there was a requirement to grow the capacity because the government had limited resources. So, to grow capacity, they had to bring in the private sector. The key aims of the deregulation in India were to provide essential air services to remote areas. Now, the government of India also tried to provide essential air services to remote areas, especially in the northeast, by bringing in an airline called as Vayudoot. But very soon it was realized that Vayudoot was not able to really operate very efficiently. It became a commercial failure because many politicians wanted to provide connectivity in their constituencies, even though there was not enough demand to sustain that activity. And because of that, many flights would go with very low capacity or even empty, and that is unsustainable in air transportation. Load factors play a very, very major role. So, the government's attempt to provide essential air services to remote areas was through Pawan Hans helicopter services, which are still operational in many areas, and also through Vayudoot, but Vayudoot was a big flop and it had to ultimately close down. Connectivity is required for economic growth, but providing connectivity requires resources which were limited with the government, and because of that the aviation infrastructure could not be developed. So, in 1994, the route dispersal guidelines part 1 were announced, where there was a categorization of routes to achieve better connectivity, and some kind of a force was put on airlines, private airlines, to necessarily offer services in certain areas. Let us have a look at the guidelines as they came in 1994. So, the routes in the country were categorized into 3 categories. There was Cat 1 route, which were the 12 trunk routes or the major routes where there was a demand, essentially between the 4 metro cities and cities like Ahmedabad and Hyderabad. Then there were Cat 2 routes, which were the routes connecting the northeastern region, Jammu Kashmir region, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and Lakshadweep and Minicoy Islands. These were areas where connectivity was very poor, even by road or rail transport. So, therefore, the government encouraged and wanted airlines to operate, but its own resources were not there. So, the private airlines which were making money from the Cat 1 or the 12 trunk routes, they were forced to deploy a part of their capacity on Cat 2 routes, and then all other routes other than the 12 trunk routes and the routes connecting these remote regions, they fell under category 3. And what were the guidelines? So, let us have a look at these routes. These are the 12 trunk routes. 6 of them originated from Mumbai, to Delhi, to Kolkata, to Chennai, to Hyderabad, to Bengaluru, and to Thiruvananthapuram. These are the 6 routes originating from Mumbai, which were under category 1. Then there were 3 such routes from Delhi, which were to Bengaluru, Hyderabad, and Chennai. And of course, Delhi to Mumbai is already covered in the first 6 routes. The next were 3 routes originating from Kolkata, Kolkata to Delhi, Kolkata to Bengaluru, Kolkata to Chennai. So, these 12 routes were called as category 1 routes, and these were the routes where most airlines wanted to fly, because these are the routes where the most of the demand was concentrated. Then we had category 2 routes, as I mentioned. These are routes in the northeastern area covering the 7 sisters. Then we have routes in Jammu Kashmir, Ladakh, Leh, routes covering the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and routes covering the Lakshadweep and Minicoy Islands. So, these 4 areas of the country which had poor connectivity, they were, any flight operating to or from these places were considered as category 2 routes, and cat 3 was the remaining routes. Now, the government introduced some guidelines for operations. They said that any amount of flights could be operated by any airline on the category 1 routes. So, the market forces will take care of the fare, and the airlines are free to choose how many flights to operate, which aircraft to operate, what frequency to offer. But from the available route passenger kilometers that the airline is deploying on cat 1 routes, 10% of those capacity had to be necessarily deployed on the cat 2 routes. So, 10% of the cat 1 deployment had to be done on cat 2 routes compulsorily, otherwise you would not be permitted to fly more on cat 1, and 50% of the capacity deployed by the airline in cat 1 had to be deployed on the cat 3 routes. So, these were the initial 1994 guidelines which were introduced by the government. So, as a result of this, airlines were forced to operate in these cat 2 and cat 3 routes to provide better connectivity all over the country. Now, some airlines encourage smaller airlines to tie up with them and to take care of their cat 2 and cat 3 requirements. Some airlines bought smaller aircraft and began operating them on cat 2 and cat 3 routes to meet these requirements. So, all kinds of arrangements were done. Then in 2016, these guidelines were further amended to include more areas and to rationalize the routes. So, again there were category of routes were 3, but one more category was introduced. In cat 1 now, the number of trunk routes was increased to 20 from 12. Now, cat 2, the routes within northeastern region, Jammu Kashmir, Andaman Nicobar and Lakshadweep remained, plus a few other routes like Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand and Cochin, Agatti, Cochin. These routes were included in category 2A, and category 2B were the routes connecting these regions to other places. So, now routes within northeastern region, within Jammu Kashmir, they were category 2A, and 2B were the routes connecting northeastern and other regions with the rest of the country, and cat 3 were all the other routes. So, now the guidelines were amended. So, here are the 20 cat 1 routes. So, you have new cities like Chandigarh, Ahmedabad, Goa, Kochi introduced in this particular, and Lucknow introduced as category 1 routes. So, there are 7 from Mumbai, 8 from Delhi, 2 from Chennai, 3 from Bengaluru. Cat 2 routes remain the same, but remember there is cat 2A which is within these areas, and cat 2B which is from the rest of the country to these areas. And the additional routes for Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, they were also introduced, and plus this one route from Agatti Islands to the Cochin airport. So, these were the category 2 routes modified in 2016. So, once again there were some guidelines for operations. Category 1, those 20 routes, there were no limits, but on category 2 you had to deploy 10% of the capacity on class 1 routes. Of these, category 2A had to be 1% of the capacity of the cat 1 routes, that is the routes within these regions of poor connectivity. Within them we had to have at least 1% of the capacity, and category 3, instead of 50%, only 35%. So, some concessions were given, but new was introduced. So 9% could be deployed on category 2B routes, 1% had to be on category A routes. So now this is the current status in the country. More and more airports are being made operational, and many flights are operating. So Air India is now privatized to Tata. Vayudoot provided links to the inaccessible regions. Northeastern wing was taken over by short haul routes. Then you have Pawan Hans Limited, which basically uses the helicopters to serve the petroleum production in the northeast and in Bombay High, and also presence in the northeastern and other states to provide connectivity to remote areas. Now, what is the current scenario? The passenger growth is around 11% and the arrival of the foreign tourists is around 16%. Today we carry freight of some 3.6 metric tons and domestic aircraft movement has grown by 14.4%. Now, there are many new policy initiatives which have been taken up by the government, such as the UDAN scheme, the drone PLI scheme, the Krishi UDAN scheme and the NASP. All these policy initiatives help in promoting the growth of aviation and air transport in the country. So, let us look at all these schemes one by one very briefly. UDAN stands for Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik. It is a regional connectivity scheme which was introduced by India, and in the year 2003 a detailed audit of this particular scheme was done by CAG and a report was issued. So, much of what you will see has come from the study of the CAG report. Now, this particular scheme was launched in 2016 under the National Civil Aviation Policy, which was released at that year. The aim of UDAN scheme is to enhance air connectivity through provision of fiscal and financial support and also through the infrastructure development. So, both ways. Some fiscal support is given to airlines which are going to operate on remote routes, and also the government will give some boost by developing the necessary infrastructure. The purpose is to promote affordability of regional air connectivity through a series of measures. Let us see what those measures are. So, there is the implementation mechanism of UDAN scheme. One of the main aims is India has more than 400 strips which are available in the country, but they are not being used primarily because of the lack of demand or the huge investment required in developing the aviation infrastructure. So, under the UDAN scheme, one of the important implementation strategies is the revival of unserved or underserved airports and routes. Then, as I mentioned, fiscal support has to be given to various stakeholders, concessions have to be given to enable them to handle this connectivity issue. Then there is a viability gap funding or VGF to the operators of the aircraft, which is direct financial support to these airlines to enable them to operate on these very thin routes. Then the Bureau of Civil Aviation Security and the state government, they have also provided cost effective security solutions at these airports. The nodal agency of the UDAN scheme continues to be the Airports Authority of India, and the focus is to encourage sustainability of operations under the regional connectivity scheme in the long term, and the connectivity that is established should not depend only on the viability gap funding in the long run. The viability gap funding was supposed to be slowly removed, and it was just a hand holding exercise to the airlines when they started the operation, just to support their initial stages. Now, what are the measures under the UDAN scheme? Lower operational cost on regional routes by supporting the airline and airport operations. So, both airlines and airports they were playing a role in reducing the operating cost, and this was done through concessions given by both the central government and the state government. That is interesting because it is not just central government, but even the state governments who are required to provide some incentives. Then, as I mentioned, there was a financial assistance through viability gap funding to the airlines. This is given to the operators for their operations on the RCS or the remote connectivity scheme routes. Then a creation of a regional air connectivity fund or RCF was created. So this particular fund is created, and it is the fund gets its money from a small levy or the fee per departure on all domestic routes that the passenger pays, and the aim of the regional air connectivity fund is to provide concessions or the viability gap funding for operations on the RCS routes. So the government does not want to really fund directly the airlines. The government says that the passengers who are going to take advantage of this service, they will give a small amount as a contribution towards the RCF. The government will probably do a top up of that as required, and from there the viability gap funding to the airlines will be given. The budgetary support of 4,500 crores in 2023 was given by Government of India. This was primarily for the development and the revival of airports, heliports, and also some water aerodromes or aerodromes which could be used for the transportation using amphibian aircraft. Our Prime Minister himself had taken a flight from Ahmedabad to the Statue of Unity to flag off this particular route. Okay. And then we also saw that in the UDAN scheme there was a demand driven mechanism created for identification of the RCS regional connectivity scheme routes. This was done by upgradation or revival of the identified airports and airstrips later. So first there was a study done to identify which are the routes that would become commercially viable in the future, and then funds were made available to upgrade or to revive these airports. There were three phases of UDAN. In the first phase, October 16 to March 21, and this particular report covers, this particular lecture actually covers all the three phases. So in UDAN 1, 132 RCS routes were identified, and 45 underserved or unserved airports were also identified. In UDAN 2, 228 fixed wing routes and 83 heliport routes were also identified. 30 unserved or underserved airports and 31 heliports were identified. In UDAN 3, 305 fixed wing routes and 26 water aerodrome routes, this is something new for the country, were identified, and 23 underserved or unserved airports and 10 water aerodromes were developed. So beyond the viability gap funding, some other concessions were also given both by the central government and the state government. From the central government side, there was a 2% excise duty on ATF for 3 years, which is much lower than what is normally charged, and the GST on the airfare was also reduced. From the state government side, less than 1% VAT on ATF for 10 years was levied, and the rates for electricity, water and other utility services at the airports were also reduced. Then the government, the state government provided free land for new airport development and enhancement. It also provided the fire and security services free of cost to the small airports, and helped by providing multimodal hinterland airport connectivity. So if there is an airport, people have to reach the airport, goods and services which have to be transported by cargo should have a reasonable facility of storage, facility for transportation. All that is required if you really want to encourage the connectivity. So efforts were made by the state government to provide these facilities, and 20% share in the viability gap funding was taken care by the state government, which was 10% for the northeastern regions and the union territories. There were also concessions from the airport operators. For example, the Airport Authority of India, which charges for route navigation and facilitation, it had given a discount to these airport operators. Only 47.5% reduction was brought in. Then there were zero landing charges. There were exemptions in parking charges. Ground handling was to be managed on the own. So despite all this, there have been many observations of the CAG on the actual outcome of the UDAN scheme, and that does not seem to be very encouraging. Nevertheless, it is important for us to note that we are trying to address a shortcoming in the market with support. So, CAG observed that the UDAN scheme was a very good initiative for increasing air connectivity, and it led to faster, safer and affordable option of travel for common people. Many common people who earlier could not dream of travelling by air were able to travel because of the UDAN scheme, and it led to a huge eco-multiplier effect. As we discussed in the initial lecture on air transportation, provision of air transport services directly affects the economical well-being of the area. There is a boost. Now, UDAN scheme has a potential to contribute towards many things, towards economic development of the region, promotion of the tourism, because if there is connectivity, only then tourists will be able to come, optimization of natural resources, preparedness during emergencies for unserved areas in case there is any requirement for transporting relief material, or there is a requirement for even serving during the defense to meet the defense requirements. If there is an airport infrastructure available, that will be very helpful for emergencies and preparedness. So, there was a positive response from passengers on the RCS routes. In 2017-18, the first year, the traffic was 2.63 lakhs. UDAN scheme was introduced in 2016. So, in 17-18, the number of passengers was 2.63 lakhs. This jumped by around 10 times in 22-23 to 24.97 lakhs. So, definitely it led to a huge boost in the number of passengers. However, financially and operationally, there are certain lacunae. Only 371 out of 774 routes, that is less than 0.5%, could actually commence operations. So, although routes were identified, but in reality only 48% could start. Out of the ones that started operation, out of the 371 that began operations, only 30% of them were able to sustain for 3 years, because initially under UDAN scheme the concessions were given only for 3 years and then it was taken up for further review. So, in the first 3 years only 30% of the 371 routes that started were able to complete the full concession, and only 48% of those 112 only they could sustain the operations beyond 3 years. Okay. So, it was a good initiative, it was aimed at improving the connectivity, it did increase the passenger throughput, but it was not able to sustain itself very well. So, 17 RCS airports were connected, and after 3 years only 7% of the awarded routes could sustain operations. So, that is a sad part of the UDAN scheme. Several audit objections were raised by CAG and 15 recommendations were made to ensure that the productivity and the commercial viability is sustained. Okay, let us move on to the next scheme of the government, which is the drone PLI scheme. PLI stands for Production Linked Incentive Scheme. It was introduced for both the automobile industry and the drone industry in September 2021. You can see that the payout of the PLI for drones and drone components from over 3 financial years, you can see that it is slowly and consistently increasing. Okay. It is increasing. So, PLI allows small operators like IdeaForge with this Switch UAV or Pelican from Bonvi Aero. These are just 2 representatives. There are many more like this. So, it is meant for drone manufacturers and companies and includes softwares development for drones. Okay. So, this particular scheme has many objectives. it wants to incentivize the manufacturing of drones and components in India, because we want to make India the global drone hub by 2030. The scheme wanted to make drones self-sustaining and globally competitive, and to create a growth-oriented regulatory framework for drones. Have a look at this particular scheme in numbers. So, there was a budgetary outlay of 120 crores for 3 years initially. So, this led to 2 times increased in the combined turnover of drone companies compared to 2021. The incentives for the drone companies and manufacturers were given. They led to less than 20% of the value addition during the next 3 years and more than 40% of the net sales. Okay. The maximum PLI for an entity was 25% of the budget of the scheme. Okay. So that it does not get concentrated in one big manufacturer. So, the maximum incentive was limited to 25%. Okay. And there were low level requirements for entry. For the MSMEs, it was 2 crores and 5 crores, and non-MSMEs it was 4 crores and 1 crore. Okay. Now, the items which are covered in the drone PLI scheme, there is a very exhaustive list. Okay. Airframe and components of drones, propulsion systems, both the IC engines and electric, power systems, batteries and other components, launch and recovery systems for launcher based drones, the initial and magnetic unit, the initial navigation system, the flight control system, the ground control system and all the components associated. The communication systems such as the radio frequency, transponders, satellite based communication systems, cameras, sensors, spraying systems and payloads, to detect and avoid systems, emergency recovery systems, trackers, all of these which were critical for safety and security of drones and for its operation. All these items are covered in the drone PLI scheme to encourage the drone industry in the country. What is the current scenario? 30 crores were dispersed, that is 1/3 of the 1/4 of the total amount, and 23 PLI beneficiaries were released. There are 12 drone manufacturers and there are 11 drone component manufacturers. The next scheme that the government introduced is the Krishi Udan scheme. This is to assist farmers in transporting the agricultural products. Many studies have shown that a large part of the agricultural produce of the country rots or gets spoilt because of poor transportation systems available to transport these decaying items or quick decaying items to remote areas. This was launched by Government of India in 2020 to assist farmers in transporting the agricultural products from the place where it is produced to the markets where they are required on both international and national routes. Okay. The aims of the Krishi Udan scheme was to improve the air logistics for agri produce, to provide seamless, cost effective and time bound transportation system. So, next year the Krishi Udan 2.0 scheme was introduced. This was to enhance the existing provisions and focusing on perishable food transport. And the focus areas were from hilly areas, from northeastern states and the tribal areas. Okay. So, what are the objectives? To facilitate and incentivize movement of agri cargo by air transportation, so that much of the produce which is lost is not wasted and it reaches the market. So, for that there were some waivers given, waivers of landing fees, waivers of parking charges, waiver of TNLC, waiver of RNFC, all these waivers were given. Then these waivers were meant for Indian freighters and passengers to cargo and passenger to cargo operators. Okay. So, the idea is to strengthen the cargo infrastructure at airports and also at areas near the airports where the items can be stored or packaged and kept in climate controlled locations so that they do not spoil. Concessions are also sought from the other bodies. Okay. Resource pooling through establishing convergence mechanism. This was another objective of the Krishi Udan scheme, and the idea was to create a hub and spoke model for transporting the freight. Plus, they also created a platform called as e-Kushal. E-Kushal stands for Krishi Udan for Sustainable Holistic Agri-Logistics. This is an e-platform to facilitate information dissemination for all stakeholders, so that a farmer or a farming body can mention what product is available at what price, so that the people who want it can place the orders. It provides all relevant information. It assists in coordination, monitoring and evaluation of the scheme. Plus, it is also integrated with the National Agricultural Market or ENAM, which is proposed. Right. So, Krishi Udan 2.0, initial one was waiver of airport charges to air cargo operators, and if the agricultural cargo is more than 50% of the chargeable weight carried, only then there were waiver. In 2, the waiver was done even if the cargo is less than 50%. So, some such subtle differences were brought in Krishi Udan 2 to encourage the Udan scheme. Now, how was it implemented? So, there were 8 ministries and departments of Government of India which were involved in this particular scheme. It benefits farmers, it benefits freight forwarders and also benefits the airline. So, in the financial year 21-22, 29% increase in perishable cargo was seen on both the domestic and international routes compared to the previous year, and 84,000 metric tons was transported in 2021. It increased to 108,000 metric tons. For phase 1 of Krishi Udan, 53 airports were selected, primarily from or more than half from hilly, northeast and tribal, which are the focus areas of these two. Remaining are from rest of the country. Now, certain routes were identified where there is a market for specific product. For example, Sikkim produces a lot of organic items including tea from the Temi tea gardens. Chennai, Vizag, Kolkata and Far East, they are very well known for seafood creation. Amritsar, there is a market in Dubai for baby corn which is produced in Amritsar. From Darbhanga, lychees can be sent to rest of the country. Agartala, Delhi and Agartala, Dubai routes are for the pineapple. Dibrugarh, Delhi and Dibrugarh, Dubai for mandarin oranges. Guwahati to Hong Kong for pulses, fruits and vegetables. So, notice most of these items are from either remote areas or underserved areas. Okay. So, there are many benefits of this particular scheme. Okay. It reduces the food wastage, it also leads to growth of the agri sector and it increases the income of the farmers. Now, we look at the National Air Sports Policy which was introduced in 2022. The central body implementing this scheme is the Ministry of Civil Aviation. The vision of this particular scheme is to make India as one of the top aerosports nations by 2030. And the mission is to provide safe, affordable, accessible, enjoyable and sustainable air sports ecosystem in India. Towards this, we need to note that we have a growing culture for adventure sports and aviation, and there are a lot of benefits in terms of growth of travel, growth of tourism, provision of local employment and also provision of infrastructure at local areas. So, the objective of this scheme is to promote air cultures in the country, to enable adaptation of the international practices both in safety, operation and infrastructure development of air sports, to enhance the participation of success of Indian sportsperson, to take them to global air sport events, to give them some room to practice within the country so that they can compete at the international level. The idea is to develop simple, stakeholder friendly and effective governance structure and to promote design, development and manufacturing of air sports equipment under the same kind of a PLI scheme that we have seen for the drones. Okay. So, the coverage is also very vast. It covers almost all activities. It covers aerobatics, aeromodeling and model rocketry. It covers amateur built and experimental aircraft, ballooning, drones, gliding and powered gliding, hang gliding and powered hang gliding, parachuting including skydiving and jumping from buildings, antennae, spans and earth, that is base jumping, and also the wingsuits, paragliding and paramotoring including the powered parachutes and trikes, powered aircraft including ultralight, microlight and light sport aircraft and rotorcraft including autogyro. So, you can notice that almost all aspects of aerosports are covered in the NASP 2022. So, the governance structure of NASP is as follows. In the center, we have the Air Sport Federation of India. That has got various other bodies and associations, for example, paragliding, skydiving, aero modeling and other sports. And the Skydiving Association has got various regional or state branches, and the districts are also shown just as an example. So, at all levels it is covering from the central federation. Okay. Now, finally, we will do a small comparison of civil aviation in India versus a few neighbors, South Asian countries. So, India is where in the center, then we have Indonesia as one of our neighbors, we have Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal, Singapore, Malaysia and Burma, okay, Myanmar. So, if we look at the jobs which are provided because of the air transportation sector, we notice that the largest amount of aviation jobs, total jobs, either direct or supply chain or employee spending or tourism, all of that the highest number is in India and the next is Indonesia. If you look at the contribution to GDP, okay, in billion US dollars, again we notice that the largest contribution is from Singapore and then it is by India. Singapore basically scores very high primarily because of the huge amount of direct and supply chain related contribution to the GDP. Singapore being, despite being a very small nation, they have really boosted their contribution a lot. If we look at the annual number of passengers via air transportation by region, we realize that from India, the largest number of passengers go to the Asian and Pacific Asian countries, then the Middle East, the next is the European Union, the next is North America, and then South America, and then Africa. This is how it is. So, and you can see the numbers for other countries also are almost in the same way. Okay. The largest market for passenger flows is the Asia Pacific except for Pakistan, where Middle East is a bigger contribution. So, you can notice that Asia Pacific from Pakistan is only 4,130,000, whereas more than that, much more than that is to the Middle East. Okay. Thanks for your attention.